a Living History production.
I'm Peter Hart, and for the last 40 years I've interviewed thousands of veterans about their experience of war. Join me on a journey through the pages of history. Welcome to Peter Hart's Military History.
Hello and welcome to another podcast. I'm Peter Hart, and with me I have, well, not with me, Gary. We're working on Zoom again. We're separated from birth. Lockdown. That's not separated from birth.
I think sometimes you should be held down.
And this is that strange voice is Gary Bain, isn't he lovely, ladies and gentlemen? And today our podcast is on life in the trenches in winter 1914. In a bleak midwinter.
Hang on a minute. So this is just going to be like Gallipoli then? It's going to be dysentery and runny jam?
There'll be things that are runny, but it'll be mainly snow and slush.
So Western
We're on the
Front
Western
then,
Front.
mainly, yeah?
I do apologise. Actually, it was pretty cold in Gallipoli at that time. And there were plenty of evacuations at that time. I hope all of you bought my book, available on livinghistoryytv.com. See how we work that in, Gary?
What's it called? The Gallipoli evacuation.
I knew that. I was just seeing if you knew.
Yeah. So we're going to be talking about life in the trenches primarily, haven't we? And I thought, well, you know, lots of people think of the trenches as being part of the problem of the image of the Western Front. You know, the mud and the blood and the rain and the trenches
poetry.
And the poetry, yeah. And I think I'm going to say right at the start here that the purpose of the trenches is to actually save lives whilst being able to kill the enemy, of course, and that they weren't new. That trenches have been used for hundreds of years. In fact, and to my own knowledge, they were used at Sebastopol. So it wasn't a new invention, was it? But this was trench lines running from the coast all the way down to Switzerland.
Yeah, indeed. And it's well, I think we need to get people's heads around the fact that in December, we're looking particularly around December 1914. That's setting. The trench isn't the thing that you see later on in the war. It isn't a neat construction, is it? It's not.
No, I mean they're in many places they're just ditches, frankly.
And they're ditches because they're the nearest cover that someone can take. And then they scratch it out, they develop it, they gradually join together the posts and create a trench system. And as you said, it went from end to end. From Switzerland to the sea, or as you said, from the sea to Switzerland,
it's Newport on the coast of Belgium all the way down. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of miles of trenches.
And they don't have a lot of sandbags, and so they're really just a slimy hole in the ground, full of mud and water. They don't have proper drainage. They don't have duck boards. They don't really have anything. The parapets are often just earth. They're not really bulletproof. People think a few inches of earth are bulletproof. They're not. Earth will go through a yard, more than a yard. Do they have the masses of barbed wire in front of them, Gary? Are they sick?
No, they probably have a little in places, but certainly nothing like we come to imagine nowadays.
So more like a farmer's fence, which perhaps they'd use to keep cows in the right place and away from footpaths, that kind of thing. Right. So let's have a look at this is a quote you're going to read from Private Douglas Kingsley of the 1st Honourable Artillery Company. I don't think any unit with you in it could ever be honourable, but Douglas Kingsley is
or company.
Good gag. Right, carry on, Gary. But sorry, Douglas.
They were seldom more than 4 feet deep, so that it was necessary to walk about with head and shoulders bent. They were nothing but man-made ditches, and we had no materials for riveting and constantly slipping muddy walls. We started to improve our surroundings by breaking up ration boxes in order to make seats at the back of the trenches. A hole was hacked out with an entrenching tool, and the end of a ration box completed the seat. Unfortunately, there was not sufficient wood available to bank in the ever-slipping slimy sides and back. In fact, often the seats had to be taken to light fires. However, experience soon taught us that it was safer to be near the front of the trench rather than the back, as all shrapnel and pieces of shell had a certain amount of momentum. Consequently, little alcoves, called funk holes, became fashionable, those being small recesses where one could huddle during a bombardment. Now, there'd been primitive recesses under the lips of the trenches in the Boer War. So it was well known that you could do that. But, of course, if you were doing that, you had to be really careful not to weaken the parapet.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Now, the trench system said were slightly unusual. Often there was a sort of communication trench also running behind the main trench, which just sort of paralleled it. That was dropped later on. But in 1914 December, they often went there. And then, of course, the more conventional, a battalion would have one or two trenches communication trenches going back to, well, not so much the support line as just back away from the front line. Otherwise, you had to go over the top. Now, we've got a quote from Private Harold Stanton of the 1st 10th King's Liverpool Regiment. Now, I like this quote because it gives you an idea. Douglas Kingsley, it wasn't exactly comfortable, but it was a trench, almost an identifiable trench. This is not an identifiable trench you're in it, is it, Gary?
Private Harold Stanton. This, an ex-enemy trench, was merely a widened ditch between two fields. The ditch contained about 18 inches of water and slime, numerous corpses, and a most appalling stench. Dugouts lined the higher side intermittently, but as those had been filled with the corpses of bayoneted Germans, they were uninhabitable. By keeping 1 foot on a dead German and lying diagonally along the clay bank, I was able to keep my body out of the water and at the same time keep my head out of sight of the enemy, who occupied a trench at the edge of the wood 15 or 20 yards away. Near me, half afloat in the water, was a dead Tommy minus one leg. Beside him, a dead Boche, badly swollen by the gases of decomposition and with parchment-like face, was threatening to burst at any moment. I was convinced that only the buttons of his mud-soaked tunic held him together.
That's pretty awful.
It is, but they're making a good point there that, heads, the natural movement of walking means that heads could be seen above the parapet. You've been in real trouble, Pete, being as tall as you are.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. You wouldn't have shot me, though. Now, when you describe things like that swollen dead Boche, I think the freezing cold, that's one small advantage, is it might have kept the stench down. Because there's an awful stench about that. It's not just the dead bodies, is it? There's more to it than that. What else could it be that making them...
Well, you've got, food refuse, human excrement. There was a real effort to keep that type of thing away from the frontline trenches in latrines, but frankly, it could move. Frankly, when artillery was involved. And dead animals, it's not just dead human beings, animals rotting in the fields all around them.
So it's a shame we haven't got Fred here to provide a sort of living example of the stench that can emanate from animals.
No. And at this point in time, this is very much like the view of the trenches. It's raining, it's pouring down December in 1914. There's no spare manpower available to achieve any sort of drainage. It's bloody awful.
Yes, and I'm going to read a quote now. And this is from Lord Edward McLachlan. He was commanding 15th Brigade.
Well, he sounds German.
It's one of those fine old English names, like Windsor. What's that? Anyway, McLachlan says that. Oh, that mud! We've heard lots about Flanders mud, but the reality transcends imagination, especially in winter. Greasy, slippery, holding clay, over your toes in most places, over your ankles in all the rest, where it's not over your knees. It is the most horrible going I know anywhere. The state of the trenches is indescribable. Some were, frankly, so full of water that they had to be abandoned, and a breastwork erected behind. And this is quite common in certain areas, especially towards the Lys Valley, the Lys, Lys. There's breastwork. Yeah, there's breastwork trenches everywhere.
Yeah, I mentioned Newport earlier. The Belgians were defending on the line of the canal, so it's awful, and I think it's just about to get worse.
What could make it worse? What could make water worse?
Well, the temperature starts to drop, I understand, and so it drops below freezing. That's going to be pretty difficult.
I can't even. We're all spoilt with our central heating and all the rest of it. But the cold absolutely penetrates their very bones. They all they can feel, all they can think about is just a dull, endless discomfort coming. There doesn't seem to be any chance of it ever going away. They can't go for a quick... I mean, can you imagine in that trench that you described, can you imagine going for a walk? Well, you can't. You'd be sniped. You just got to stand about in freezing cold water, often over your boots, over your ankles. Oh, and then there's snow, Gary. Lovely, lovely snow. And everybody loves a little snowstorm, don't you? Not if you're in the trenches. And this is Lieutenant Sir Edward Hulse of the 2nd Scots Guards. What does he think of it?
It has been snowing hard after 2 nights' sharp frost, and it is lying about 2 inches
deep. Is this
deep,
your posh voice?
Except in the foot of the trenches, where, by the continual passage of men up and down, it has become a freezing cold slush of mud, and chills one's boots right through. We have not changed our boots or socks even, and far and away the worst part is the cold in one's feet at night, which makes sleep impossible for more than half an hour or so at a time.
That's pretty awful. I imagine a night, Gary. Just how you're freezing cold. You can't get to sleep. It just no hope. It was awful. And there's a new ailment starts to appear, and it's what they call trench foot. And this is Lieutenant Arthur Ackland of the 1st Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, and he says this: the bottom of the trenches became deep in icy mud. In this they stood up to their knees day and night. Perhaps I should have done my Cornish accent. No, it always turns into pirate, doesn't it?
Yes.
Up to their knees day and night, for we could not spare a man from the trenches, and soon we began to experience what we called frost-bitten feet, and we call trench feet, but never mind, he called it frost-bitten feet. No one knows quite what it is, but I think myself it comes from the continual pressure of the mud and the lack of ventilation to the feet. Anyway, it's a dreadful thing, and the men suffered agonies from it. Now, trench feet, frostbite, trench feet, they're awful, and it's caused by the continually being in water and the freezing cold. And some of them just, you touch them and they hurt. And some of them, they go the other way. You get a complete loss of all feeling. The feet would swell. They become red. They get blisters. And then what would you think it means if your toes go black? Is that a good sign? Are they getting better, Gary?
No, I think you're likely looking at gangrene by that point.
Oh dear. That doesn't sound good. You can lose your feet, your toes. You can lose your feet.
Yeah, you can be crippled from it. Yeah.
Now, how do you avoid it? Well, tell me how you avoid trench feet, Gary. How would you avoid it?
Oh, well, clearly you keep your feet out of the water, so you just lie on your back and keep your feet pointing out the top of the trench.
That'll do. That's one great idea. What if you can't, for some reason, perhaps the Germans do that? What else could you do?
Well, prevention's better than cure, frankly. So, and to this day, looking after your feet in the armed forces is very important. You've got to try to keep them dry. That's not always possible.
Not in the trenches,
no. No. So they rubbed them dry and they cleaned and put dry socks on wherever they could.
Where did they get the dry socks from?
Well, strangely enough, a lot of the socks were being sent from people at home, sometimes complete strangers. I think we come on to that a bit later.
So that's it. Now, what they have to do, a lot of it is stuff that can't be done immediately, isn't it? So the real answer, if you want to keep your feet dry, you're going to have a drainage system.
Got to be above the water.
So that means duck boards. Now, duck boards are just plank systems, basically, that raise you above the water. Now, the other thing is liberal and regular application of whale oil to the feet. Well, they hadn't exactly thought of that. I mean, why would you think, I know what I'll do, I'll kill a whale, I'll get a load of oil out of it, and I'll rub it on my feet. Now, would you think of that in the trench in Flanders?
No, I'd be marching up and down with a Save the Whale placard. Plus, I don't think there's many whales lying around in Flanders, is there?
No, you might have a bit of trouble. So that's something that's, it's all right. Now, lots of people, you're right. Lots of people at home, they're well-intentioned, they're lovely people, and they send things out to the men. Now, how do the men react? Well, the men react like British soldiers always do. If you try and be nice to a British soldier, they'll laugh at you. And this is Captain Cecil Brownlow, I love this quote, of the 40th Brigade Royal Field Artillery. What are you going to say?
Well, firstly, I'm going to make sure I've got the right glasses on here.
Oh.
Many of them were of extraordinary shapes and sizes. Attached to many articles were little cards bearing messages of goodwill. One, from a maiden lady, said, "I'm a little doubtful as to the size of a man's sock, but I hope these will be large enough and will keep you warm." These happened to be so large that they were used as sleeping helmets and warmed not only our heads but also our hearts.
I just love this little old lady. I don't know how big a man's socks are. I'll just make it this size. Oh dear, what a disappointment for a young woman. Anyway, right now, so it's all but. It's very depressing. This is a backdrop to everything else we're talking about. It's freezing cold. It's water that's ice or nearly ice. It's windy. It's horrible. It's bloody useful. Now, somehow they have to get the food forward for the men to eat. And this is for thousands and thousands of men. It's a major undertaking. So they'd have to send ration parties back every single night. Now, you couldn't do it a day, could you?
Why not? Why couldn't you do it during the day?
Them Germans. I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if the Germans are really our friends. Well, then, obviously they're our friends now. But they just kept shooting us. I don't know why they do that. Anyway,
No, it must have been really difficult.
Yeah, because do you think they had torches?
No.
Well, this is Private Edward Rowe of the 1st East Lancashire Regiment, and you're going to read his quote describing what it's like, aren't you, Gary?
It is an agony of endurance trying to get rations up to the firing line. The nights are dark and wet. The turnip field is pitted with shell craters which are full of water. The dikes on each side of the road to headquarters are full of water. The regimental transport dumps the rations on the road opposite headquarters in an indiscriminate pile. The party gets loaded up and struggles towards the firing line. Will the Germans open up with machine guns before we get there? Or will we be lucky enough to get back to the trenches without coming under machine gun fire? Those are our thoughts as we struggle along with our loads. Ping, 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 swish! Down go the boxes, sandbags and rolls of cheese. We dive into the dikes on either side of the road. We're up to our necks in water, but we're alive. He fires down the road, traverses left and right, then stops. Come on, lads. Let's get a move on before he starts again.
And remember, you've just got soaked in freezing cold water. How are you going to get dry? When are you going to get dry? Because next night, it's got to be done again. This isn't just once. They have to do it every sodding night. A ration party has to go back. The routine of the trenches is always pretty unrelenting. For the officers, perhaps a little easier, but they've got the responsibility of making sure everybody else is doing their job. Or at least making sure, I'll be absolutely honest with you, making sure the NCO's making sure everybody's doing their job. But sometimes people just got so tired, so exhausted, and they just drifted to a sort of, I don't know, a stupor, a bit like, I don't know. Anyway, you're going to be Lieutenant Sir Edward Hulse again, 2nd Scots Guards.
I found one whole platoon in the most hectic state ever seen. Not a sentry on the alert. The NCO on duty sitting down instead of patrolling his lines, and 100 other things. Any enterprising 20 or 30 Huns could have simply walked right in. Unless one is at it day and night, nothing is done. There are individuals, scouts, etc., volunteers and picked men, who are priceless and worth a whole platoon in themselves. But by Jove, one has to work at the rest. The unfortunate part was having every single one of our serving NCOs knocked out when the battalion took the knock originally. Half of them don't seem to understand English or any other language for that matter.
By taking the knock, he means the casualties at Mons and Le Cateau and the rest of it. Well, and first Apes, of course. Now, in most battalions, your sentry go was 2 hours. 1 man per section on duty during daylight and 1 man in 3 throughout the night. So if you think about it, that during the night you get 4 hours sleep out of 6. There's 3, and that assumes that the Germans didn't do anything. Now this is Private Harold Stanton again, 1st 10th King's Liverpool. Right? Oh, that was an appropriate use of the Germans. And it's quite scary being on sentry duty, isn't it? Come on, let's have your best Scouse accent, Gary.
In the first gleam of half-light before dawn, I think I might read this normally. In the first gleam of half-light before dawn, when the trees were emerging from silhouette into things with shape and form, I was peeping over my sights through the base of the hedge when a large form silently rose and obscured my sight of the trees. It could only have been an enemy, and instinctively I took a quick, rough bead on the massive target and squeezed the trigger. Whatever it was sank to the ground and out of my vision. Now I was tense with suppressed excitement. I felt sure that I had disposed of a murderous sniper and in a bated whisper told my neighbour so. But where was the evidence? I had to wait impatiently for dawn to break before finding it. The grey uniformed body of a big and bulky German lying silent and still 3 or 4 yards away.
That's a close escape. Normally these stories, it's a sheep or a cow. But in that case, it really was a German. Now, sometimes almost not. You can imagine how tense he was, Harold Stanton, how tense people got. And almost anything could sort of trigger a sort of mass outbreak of, well, hysteria and shooting and banging away. And this is, have you heard of this person? Second Lieutenant Bruce Bairnsfather of the 1st Warwickshire. Why have you heard of him, Gary?
He's the guy who does the little cartoons for his son, isn't he, that became so popular?
And some of which are funny.
and collectible.
And very collectible. I haven't got any. Only got the collected things. Anyway, they were gathered together, and a lot of you people will have bought the little magazines that were put out at the time, and that's great. Anyway, this is him from his time in the line. He said this: perhaps an inquisitive Boche, somewhere a mile or 2 on the left, had thought he saw someone approaching his barbed wire. A few shots are exchanged, a shout or 2, followed by more shots, panic, more shots, panic, spreading. Then suddenly the whole line of trenches on the front of a couple of mines succumbs to that well-known malady, wind up. The firing becomes faster and faster, then suddenly swells into a roar. Everyone's standing to the parapet, and away on the left, a tornado crackling sound can be heard, getting louder and louder. In a few seconds, it's swept on down the line, and now a deafening rattle of rifle fire is going on immediately in front. Bullets are flicking the tops of the sandbags and the parapets in hundreds, whilst white streaks are shooting up with a swish into the sky and burst into bright, radiating blobs of light. The star shell at its best. Presently there comes a deep boom from somewhere in the distance behind, and a large shell sails over our heads and explodes somewhere amongst the Boche. Another and another, and then all becomes quiet again. The rifle fire diminishes and soon ceases. Total result of one of these firework displays: several thousand rounds of ammunition squibbed away, hundreds of star shells wasted, and no casualties. Hopefully no casualties. That's I think that's a great description. You get the real feel of it from Bairnsfather. Great bloke. Now, the 4 hours when you're off sentry duty, do you think the army leave you to sort of put your feet up and have a nice rest? Or do you think they find something for you to do?
No, and sometimes I think it could be more dangerous or physically exhausting than being in the line.
Yeah, so who are you going to be now? You're going to be...
I'm going to be Private Douglas Kingsley of the 1st Honourable Artillery Company again. And he says, in true army fashion, it was more than likely that a sergeant would call for volunteers, usually done by his saying, I want 6 volunteers, you and you and you. possibly to take out barbed wire entanglements, repair some part of the trench which had caved in under shell fire, or take part in a burial party. In fact, so numerous were the daily toils necessary for the maintaining of human life under such conditions that it would be almost impossible to enumerate them.
There's a lot to do, isn't there? A lot of tasks. Just digging drainage, trying to dig drainage would be enough. Now, they've also got to send out patrols and raiding parties, because if you don't know who you're facing, if you don't notice when the Germans change unit, they could be planning an attack. If you don't take prisoners, if you don't monitor what they're doing in their trenches, they'll come and kill you. And this is, you're going to be Lieutenant George Ruppel of the 1st East Surrey Regiment. What does George say, Gary?
We often went out patrolling, and I usually took the same men with me, always volunteers at this time, and Corporal Parks always came.
Do you think Corporal Parks arranged for those same volunteers?
Yeah, probably. We climbed out of our trenches, got through the wire and across the stream, and then started to crawl. As a rule, we moved up one of the hedges to avoid being seen in the open field when a very light went up. That's a good point. It's your point about it being just ditches and not sophisticated trenches at this time. They're just out into the hedges.
This is countryside, yeah.
We could not do this every night, as the enemy might have been waiting for us in the hedge, so we varied this with a crawl across the open field. It was quite exciting work. Every noise, even if it was made by one of our own men, made us halt, and we used to lie flat for ages.
Now, wherever this is the part we want to look now a bit about snipers, because wherever you are in the trenches, you're at risk, aren't you? And you made that very good point about if you're over 5'7", 8", which was quite tall then, you were in danger. If you were over 6 foot, the chances of you getting a bullet through the top part of your skull are high. This is Second Lieutenant William Smalley of the 1st Sherwood Foresters, fine body of men. And he says this: one gets bullets coming in from all sides. They apparently climb trees or live in the cellars of destroyed houses and simply pop away all through the night, having first laid the rifle by day. He means they lay him on a target, fix it, so it's say, pointing at a gap in the trenches or a low bit. In the German trenches, it seemed as though they have tripods or fixed rests for their rifles and have them sighted all the time on a loophole or a T just at the back of the trench, or any conspicuous mark along our front. One gets bullet after bullet coming through the same loophole during the night, and always hitting the same spot in the rear. Sorry to say, we've lost 2 officers killed and 1 wounded so far. I don't know where the ruin came from. This was in a letter home. He wrote the letter home, and it was published in the Nottingham Daily Express on the 8th of December. And our friend Jim Grundy has probably read and knows of this chap. In fact, I'm sure he does. The very next day after it was published, on the 9th of December, William Smalley was killed. Do you know how he was killed, Gary?
He was shot by a sniper.
Yeah. It's whilst crossing an exposed path. You can know about a danger, but you can't make yourself safe. You can only try your best. Now, in view of that, it's also strange to think that the British Army is the British Army, isn't it? So, what does it do? How do some people react to this danger?
Well, they sort of have a risky amusement about it and take risks. And this is a quote from Private Douglas Kingsley again, of the 1st Honourable Artillery Company. And he says, "It is peculiar how under strain and stress a sharpening of humour and wit seems to run through most Englishmen. A constant source of amusement was the placing of an old hat on a stick, walking with it along the trench, or bobbing it up and down to tempt a Hun to take odd pots at it, knowing perfectly well that one was quite safe. This was sometimes done purposely so that somebody a few hundred yards further up would be able to spot an enemy sniper being tempted to expose his position by firing at the moving target." And you can imagine somebody marching up and down with his hat on a stick.
They didn't do much of this later on because the Germans used to just lob a minion worth of shell across, which... very funny. Cop hold of this, pal. Anyway, sniping is a dangerous business and a cold-blooded business. Sometimes snipers are unpopular. You remember the most famous Australian sniper, Billy Singh in Gallipoli, was was quite unpopular. They're seen as cold-blooded, and they need a lot of patience, and they have to be cold-blooded. And this is Sgt Frederick Brown of the 1st 2nd Monmouthshire Regiment.
One morning, Lieutenant Patton, platoon officer, sent for me. A German sniper was reported shooting from a small square window in a barn some 300 yards away. He could be seen easily through the officer's field glasses, but indistinctly with the naked eye. I took a careful sight on the bottom centre of the window, fired, and Lieutenant Patton, watching through his glasses, exclaimed, "Good shot, Sergeant!" He saw him throw up his arms and fall backwards. I was not yet hard-baked enough to remain unmoved by this incident. Now, it's interesting, he mentions 300 yards there. That's about the limit that you would have a sniper set up to shoot a moving target. And a lot of people don't actually know that snipers would want to get closer, if at all possible, and often would be in front of the trenches when taking the shot.
Well, they're not going to be aiming at a whole body. They're aiming at just, say, the top 2 inches of a head, or they're aiming at a loophole. So the closer they can get, the better. Now, some people wouldn't take shots. The ordinary soldier often didn't have this attitude. And if a German, if there's thousands are running towards you, they'll shoot them down as happily as Larry. But if it's just one person, they often seem to have almost scruples about it.
Well, it's almost personal, isn't it, when it's one person?
And this is Brigadier General Lord Edward Gleichen of the Headquarters 15th Brigade. And I like this quote. I might have to... No, I won't do a posh voice. When going around the trenches, I asked a man whether he'd heard any shots of the Germans, whether he had had any shots of the Germans. He responded, there was an elderly gentleman with a bald head and a long beard, who often showed himself over the parapet. Well, why didn't you shoot him? Shoot him? Said the man. Why, Lord bless you, sir, he's never done me no harm. A case of live and let live, which is certainly not to be encouraged. But cold-blooded murder is never popular with our men. And that's the point of it. It is seen as murder to some men. They just don't want to do it. They give a chap a fair chance, all that kind of attitude. Now, there is one thing that is the real enemy in the trenches. It's the big cause of the biggest load of casualties, and it's not machine guns. If you're in a trench and not attacking, machine guns are not your problem. What's your problem, Gary?
Well, it's largely German shells.
Artillery shells, that's it. Or mortar, you're quite right. They could just come down anywhere, couldn't they? Yeah.
And it's random. It's completely random. It can take you out or your mate out or round the corner.
And this is Major Gerald Burgoyne, 2nd Royal Irish Rifles. Lovely bunch of lads, lovely boys. And he says this, their shells are bursting now on the near edge of my trenches, then 10 to 15 yards to my immediate front, and at each tearing scream we all crouched close to the inner wall of the trench. Nearer and nearer we heard the shell. After a time it was possible to tell whether it was coming to right or left of your position, but equally possible to say with certainty, there's one for us. And the few seconds' terrible wait. Would it burst in front or behind, or would it be the one? Somehow curiosity to see what happened prevented one being afraid. Not sure that would have worked with us, Gary. And anyhow, It was no use feeling afraid. We had to stick there. For the whole of that hour, the din was awful, awe-inspiring. The whole of creation was trembling. And this is the point. And there's also it doesn't matter how skillful a soldier you are, how whether you've got a second sense as to where shells are going, however cautious you could be, there's not much you could do, is there? Because what's the German gunner doing? He doesn't know where you are, does he? He's just setting a sight on a bloody gun. He's got no idea about you. He's just firing a shell over there. And if you're under it, then it doesn't matter what, it's going to kill you.
And it wasn't often just a single shell, was it? It's a barrage of shells.
And then, of course, as you mentioned, the trench mortars, the Minenwerfer, as they were called, sending up their shells. And they go right up high and come back down. Well, mortars, sorry. Now, the British, do we have that kind of... can we hit back with mortars and things?
Well, bearing in mind, it's December 1914. No, we've got nothing like that at all.
We have some sort of Heath Robertson mortars that we make ourselves, the Royal Engineers make, and we also have improvised hand grenades. Now, what could go wrong with an improvised hand grenade? That's what I want to know. The earliest sort was often the jam tin bomb. What do you imagine a jam tin bomb was made from, Gary?
Jam.
No, I think you've concentrated on the wrong part of the word.
Okay.
It was the tin round the jam guy.
We have talked about the improvised bombs that were made when we talked about Gallipoli, for example. It was the same in other fronts, but they are incredibly unpredictable. And of course, the men are not trained in how to use them, which is another aspect.
Were they squaddy proof?
No.
Were they even officer proof?
No. This is a quote from Lieutenant James Hindson of the 1st Loyal North Lancashire Regiment. And he says, the type of bomb now produced for our edification is made from an ordinary plum and apple jam tin with an attached fuse which has to be lit by a match before throwing. No one, except a few engineers, knows anything whatever about the bomb and its habits. One of the first produced was put by some irresponsible idiot on a heating stove in the officers' mess and then forgotten. It was not spotted for some time, not indeed until it was nearly red hot, and the individual in question was ordered to remove it and drop it in a bucket of water. During this process, most of us made ourselves extremely scarce.
So would I. I love this idea of them all sat in the officers' mess, which would be just some sort of dugout or farm building, and this grenade on the stove getting hotter and hotter. I wonder if it was done deliberately by some Gary-like figure. Anyway, so we're just not ready. The British are not ready for trench warfare. They don't have the necessary equipment. And it's not just the mortars, the hand grenades. They haven't even got waders, normal waders to put on their leggies. They haven't got the right digging tools. Your entrenching tool, it's about as much use as a sausage. You know, it's
You can cook a sausage.
Yes, all right. It's much, much less use than a sausage. So now, casualties. There's a steady trickle of casualties for the British in the trenches. Even when it's quiet, there are casualties from sniping. But during an attack, it would swell up. And there are attacks in December. We're not going to deal with them. But we launched some of our earliest trench-to-trench attacks. And we want to now talk a bit about the medical side of it. Because how do they deal? What's the chain of events? Well, how do they deal with it? Well, the stretcher bearers for each battalion, they would collect the wounded from the battlefield and take them back to advanced dressing posts. They're normally in some building close by, some old farm building. Remember, we're in 1914. There are still buildings near the battlefield. And each one of these wounded, of course, they've got their own story. But what happens to them when they get back? They're going back, and they meet the doctor who does triage tests, which is basically right. Your head's falling off, no treatment. You're badly wounded, we best treat you. And you're not wounded, you've got a light wound, we're not treating you. So it's working out who it's worth treating. You've got too many to treat, so the people who are not badly wounded are left, and the people who are going to die are left. Now, this is Captain Robert Dolby of the 2nd King's Own Scottish Borderers. They were a fine body of men. I don't want to say that, but I've got to.
Fine body of men.
Derek from Hike will kill me. He said this: one felt that one was very glad to be so close up and to be so helpful, and yet one felt so strangely helpless. There was so much to be done, so many for whom surgery could do so little. The abdominal cases that died so soon, the brain cases that took so long to die. And of all the dreadful wounds in war, the lacerating brain wound is the most harrowing. Restless, noisy, delirious, the unhappy victims struggle with the men who would restrain them, babbling of private matters, of domestic things, crying for water, and yet spitting it out when brought. And the wounds come in every shape and form. There's no part of the human body the shell won't blast. It just everything, your whole body. It's not going to miss your eyes just because you don't, or your willy or any other part of you. It's just going to smash home. And this is Lieutenant Arthur Martin, 15th Field Ambulance RAMC.
The first case attended to was that of a young soldier of the Norfolks who had been struck by a shell in the abdomen. His intestines were lying outside the body and loops were inside the upper part of his trousers. Under chloroform, we did what we could. He died painlessly 4 hours afterwards. There were many bad shell wounds of the head, one necessitating a trepanning operation. One poor fellow had his tongue half blown off. The loose bit was stitched on. The compound fractures were numerous and of a very bad type, associated with much shattering of the bone.
Terrible, terrible. A trepaning's where they drill a hole in your head through your skull to release the pressure. It's awful. So all these new things. Now there's something else. This is 1914. They were becoming aware of a new threat in the soil of Flanders. What was that, Lieutenant Martin?
When a man got wounded, some dirt was bound to get into the wound, but a man's hands and clothes were usually caked with mud. If a man is struck on the face or limbs, he will at once put his hands on the injured part. It's a movement which is almost involuntary. The hands of the men in the trenches were infected with the bacilli of this gas gangrene, and when these infected fingers touched a recent wound, the wound itself became infected with these highly dangerous organisms. Pieces of khaki cloth, caked in mud, were often driven into the wounds and the bullets and shrapnel. And on this cloth there were, of course, millions of the deadly little beasts. If the case reached us soon after the onset of gangrene, a cure could almost certainly be promised. If the case arrived late, when the limbs were dead, amputation was the only conservative treatment that one could adopt. Many of the cases sent to me were beyond any hope of recovery and soon died. All the cases of gas gangrene had a very penetrating, putrefactive smell, which is quite characteristic.
Now, that wasn't
That's
the only...
horrible.
It's awful. And they did stink. It was awful. There was something else that was lurking in the mud. What was that? You're going to be Arthur Martin again.
Another complication of our wounds at this time was tetanus, or the so-called lockjaw. When tetanus manifests itself, when the convulsions and muscular spasms come on, it's a terrible malady to treat, and most of the cases die.
And I remember always dodging. You know when you have an accident?
Yeah, tetanus injection.
And you get a tetanus. They used to say, have you had a tetanus injection recently? And I always used to say, yes! to avoid getting one. And when you hear descriptions like that, you realise just how stupid you can be. Well, I can be. Now, from the forward post, they would be taken back to field ambulance and then back to clearing, say, Shoreland. Now, Sister Martha Aitken was one of the dedicated female nurses dealing with all these seriously wounded men, and she was at Wimereux Hospital. It was a former hotel that had been converted into a hospital, and she said this, and no silly voices because this is awful. The wounds are fearful in some cases. There are 6 bad head cases among them. The men all have huge gashes, and one could see the brain pulsating when the dressing is going on. Poor men, and they make such good patients, and hardly utter a groan when I'm sure they must suffer agonies. One poor man was dreadfully injured. He had a compound fracture of both femurs, and the left humerus as well as a hole in his head. Oh dear. Fortunately, he soon got quite unconscious and died 2 days later. These men who are able to be moved are soon sent across the channel, and the others are kept here and nursed until their time comes. It means they either die or their time comes to go across the channel. How bravely they bear all their pain, and even lie in bed and make jokes about what they have come through. One and all, they are glad to get into bed and feel that they can sleep and fear no night attack. A clean shirt and bed are all they ask. But some of the men are suffering mental traumas. This is the shell shock of legend and reality. Shell shock isn't a disease, it's a collation of symptoms. Lieutenant Arthur Martin, you're going to be him again. He's got a fairly sympathetic, it's a reasonably sympathetic approach to it, hasn't it?
I attended one young officer and 3 men who had been buried in the earth when their trench was blown up. The officer and 1 man were unconscious, and when the man recovered consciousness, he was nervy and excitable. He had a startled, terrified expression, and when in bed he would peer round in a wild, anxious way, and then suddenly pull the blankets well over his head and curl up underneath, as if anxious to shut out his surroundings, or what he thought were his surroundings. He seemed really to be living through some terrifying experiences of the past few days antecedent and up to the time when his trench was blown up and he was engulfed in the mud and debris. The officer recovered consciousness more slowly and spoke in a curious staccato speech. His nerves were completely gone and he had fine tremors of the lips and tongue and fingers. He told me that his memory had gone, that he had only a hazy recollection of recent things which seemed far away and dim.
And there's so many of these symptoms of shell shock, nervous twitches, uncontrollable shouting, a bit like Tourette's, shouting and screaming, night terrors. People lost their hearing and their eyesight through post-traumatic stress. We like to think we don't call it a disorder, do we, Gary? Because it's almost a natural response to these terrible things they've been through. It is a real thing, to be honest, I'm glad to turn away from it. Let's turn away from it and look at another aspect of life in the trenches. And that aspect of life in trenches is being out of the trenches. There's a complex system in the British Army of you're in the front line for 2 or 3 days, you come back into support line if you have one, and then you get periods out of the line, all the rest of it. When they came out of the line, they usually billeted in farms, farm outbuildings, houses in villages. They're very welcome to get back to these things. But then there's another aspect of life in the trenches and life outside, and people notice it more when they're out of the freezing cold. What's that, Gary? It's lice, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And Private Harold Stanton, our old friend from the 1st 10th King's Liverpool Regiment, says, "Who the previous inhabitants were, I do not know, but they left us a heritage which we could gladly have avoided. They must have been alive with body lice. They seized upon us as virgin soil and avidly planted their vile eggs in our protesting flesh. The kilt pleased them enormously, it would. For the thickness of the cloth and the numbers of the folds in the neighbourhood of the waist provided both funk holes and heat. What more could the pioneering spirit of the enterprising louse desire? We scratched and we swore and we scratched."
That is a lovely quote, isn't it? A lovely quote. Now, the army organised bath facilities to try and get rid of these lice and also just get the men clean. Otherwise, there's lots of things, impetigo. There's lots of these things, scabies that people get. And they were in, the ones that are most famous, the ones in ex-breweries, old breweries, the vats acted as huge baths. And this is Private Arthur Cook of the 1st Somerset Light Infantry, another lovely regiment. Their museum, the museum's fantastic down there in Somerset Land, as we call it.
Private Arthur Cook. On arrival at the brewery, we undressed in a room, taking off everything except shirt and boots. Our khaki coat, trousers and cap, less the chin strap, were tied in a bundle and placed in a fumigator, and vest, pants and socks were carted off, lice and all, for boiling. We then had to go out into the open along the towpath for about 50 yards, in full view of the ladies on the bank.
"Oh, look at the soldiers, he's got no clothes on."
We had only a shirt on, and it was windy and bitterly cold. Well, don't want it cold. So we did not loiter for their benefit. The high wind did not help our modesty. The bathtubs were large beer vats, and 10 men were allotted to each vat. We were soon in like a lot of excited kids. Every now and then we had a peep over the side to see if our boots were okay, as we were told that they were likely to be pinched. We were now a very lousy crowd, for the lack of washing had bred lice by the thousand, and the surface of our bath water was soon a thick scum of these vermin. We scratched each other's backs to ease the itching. Towels and soap were ready, and when we were dry we got a clean shirt. Then we had to go back along the canal bank where the girls were still waiting. It must have been very cold for them, but I suppose they thought it was worthwhile.
Ah, we're mad. Yes, wonderful, wonderful quote. Now, the men are often on working parties when they're out, and they weren't that keen on them. And this is just a fantastic quote from Major Gerald Burgoyne of the 2nd Royal Irish Rifles. Now, Gerald Burgoyne comes across as an absolute first-rate bastard. There's no 2 points in disguising the fact. He is a complete bastard. But this quote is just fantastic. It goes like this. I'll read it to you. No silly voice. The man doesn't deserve a silly voice. He's silly enough. This morning, I saw a fatigue party marching off. The men all over the place. No discipline. And the corporal in charge, useless. You were a useless corporal, weren't you?
I was.
I called out to them, but one man took no notice. So I ran out and gave him 2 under the jaw. They pulled themselves together then and marched off, something more like soldiers. On parade this afternoon, I saw another man scrim-shanking. Had seen the company parading, but was just getting a drop of a tea hotted. I lifted him, a couple of the best, and kicked him till he ran, and then I spoke a few well-chosen words to the men, told them that if they did not play the game to me, I'd lead them a dog's life, and if they played up well, I'd look after them well. I'm sure my little show of firmness had its effect. All men like an officer who compels obedience. And it's no use punishing a man on active service as one does in peacetime. The only thing is to hit him at once and hard, and the men will see that their officer takes a real personal interest in them. Now, people say, how can you laugh when there's death and destruction? But when you've got an officer like Major Gerald Burgoyne, did your officers used to take a real and personal interest in you? Because I believe there was one occasion, one night outside the officers' mess, where a young officer did take a personal interest in you and kicked the hell out of you.
In a fairly similar way, actually.
He kicked hell out of you, didn't he?
He did, yes.
So, it just did you afterwards respect him and thank you for the personal interest?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I felt he was taking me very personally.
Yes. Right. Now, the men would be they'd be going to Stebnicki, small cafes, just run by local Belgians and French. They'd drink. They'd drink as much as they could, or as much as they wanted to. Dull the senses a bit. Sex. Would they do that? Well, they would when they could.
Not with each other.
Not with hope for. Well, not each to their own, Gary. Let's be a little more tolerant about this. But I think the main thing is, and this is a crudity, I'm going to say it anyway, but prostitution is the soldier's idea of women's war work. And it's there, and it's a terrible perspective, but that's what they saw women as. Either professional or unprofessional, as a sexual release. It is very unfortunate, but it is how it is. And then there was another sinful pleasure, cards or I suppose football. But they spent their time as they could. Now, there's not much to cheer them up about all this, is there?
Except you're hoping that the Germans are bloody getting exactly the same or suffering more than you are.
What, you think that
would cheer you up?
Those bastard craps are getting it worse than we are.
Yeah.
Have you got any evidence that the Germans were suffering, Gary, or are you just saying this in a random and cheerful manner?
There was misery on both sides, and this is Pioneer Friedrich Nicklaus of the 53rd Reserve Pioneer Company. Things have got very much worse. Flanders is just one great morass, and all military operations have been brought to a standstill by the mud. Day and night we stand up to our knees in mud and water. We have to wrap our legs up to our thighs in sandbags just to survive. The rain pours incessantly from above, while beneath us the water table has risen to just below ground level. The lookout positions have been raised up on stilts, and the water is bailed out of the trenches using pots and pans and any container to hand. If only there were such things as pumps in the trenches. In the communication trenches we have built raised walkways because it is simply impossible to drain them. On top of all this, the mad gun battle goes on across this forsaken plain, stretching out in front of us as flat as a tabletop, where it is dangerous even to raise your head above ground during the day.
Hell on earth for both sides then, eh? Now,
interestingly, we have not at any point mentioned rats.
But surely rats, like poetry, is absolutely endemic in the trenches. They're everywhere, aren't they? Or are they?
Well, they were in some trenches. I mean, not in every trench. And, if you, for example, if you had a trench on the edge of a canal, you'd get the water. You'd probably get rats. And they thrived, and you've seen the pictures of them eating the corpses and gnawing on faces and things like that. But actually, they were just as much of a problem for the living, because they would run across the sleeping. If people hung rations up, the rats were practically acrobatic in their attempts to reach the rations. And so, we've gone through this whole thing without even mentioning them.
And we haven't much mentioned poetry either.
No, we'll have to put that right. We should have a whole podcast on it.
We should.
Now, although you mentioned that these are very early trenches and they're very primitive, for those of you that visit the Western Front or want to visit the Western Front, there are a number of trench systems that you could visit, particularly in the Apes area, where you've got, for example, Yorkshire Trench or Sanctuary Wood, but you've also got a German trench system at Bayernwald Trench, which is near Weishaupt. And, of course, you've got the Trench of Death, which is the Belgian trench system up near Dixmunder. And I would really recommend a visit to all of those. I've been to all of them, and I think that it's well worth the time if you're in the area.
It is, and just to get an idea of what it was like, of course we could just, while you're in there, throw a bucket of water on, freezing cold water on you, and then shoot every third one of you, just to really... Every 10th one, sorry, I must not exaggerate. I must. Millions of times I've told myself to must not exaggerate. Now,
you could walk along a trench and I could hit you in the head for realism, as your head would be protruding above it,
just bobbing up. Yes, every so often.
Yeah.
You just aim a bit ahead and clunk.
Yeah.
Now, I've enjoyed doing this podcast. I would urge all of you to listen and share with us. You can find us on social media. We're on Facebook, Peter Hart's Military History, and we're on Twitter as well. Please do share and retweet our episodes. That really, really helps. And if you want to really go the extra mile, then if you write a review for us, I believe, according to Matt McLachlan, our sponsor and benefactor, that the best place to do that is on the Apple site. But anywhere you choose to write a review. If the review says we're lovely, if the review says there are a mean and twisted pair of bitter wankers, our favourite ever review, then possibly keep it to yourself.
You may well find your review ending up on our business cards.
Yes, that is on our business card now. All right, well, nice to see you again, even though it's at a distance. Bye.
See ya. Cheers, mate.